Warning, this guide features early-ish strats for P12S. While the information in this video should be accurate enough to get you a kill, more optimized strats are almost certain to be discovered in the following weeks if they haven't already. Make sure to check the description below for links to any newer, better strats. Hi guys, and welcome to a Hector lecture guide to the fight P12S Phase I. This is Athena. For this fight, the only positions you desperately need to have are clock spots that are going to be relative to these little clusters that we see. For these, I recommend having tanks and melees be near to the front, healers and ranged near to the back, though the order you choose is up to you. Note that these have to be boss relative, meaning that you want to rotate these to make sure that you always have your tanks and melees nearest to it. Face your camera towards the boss, and then it should be the same direction left or right. For many of these clock spots, it's really easy to adjust them into partners, just as tanks collapsing onto melees and healers collapsing onto ranged. Two mechanics I want to explain before we do any of the proper fight, because they show up so often mixed with other mechanics. One of them is Trinity of Souls. This is the one you saw from the normal mode version, in which 3 rings appear on the boss, and this indicates 3 half-arena cleaves that go off one after another after the cast bar finishes. However, in Savage mode, we have a variation on this. If the rings go top to bottom, it's normal, but if the rings go bottom to top, the middle ring is a debate. While you see the middle ring on the B side, instead the D side is going to get cleaved because for the middle ring only, the boss will do a 180-degree spin. What this means is that you read the first and the third as they appear, but the second one you do the opposite of how it looks. This can seem really confusing, so I recommend instead memorizing the 3 patterns that you'll see with this. This all works on the premise that from bottom to top, you're only ever going to have to do at most 1 dodge. So if you see the bottom 2 rings on the same side, this means you're doing what's called the early dodge pattern. Start on the safe side, and dodge after the first cleave. The other 2 are always going to be on the other side, and you're fine. If from bottom to top you see the first 2 rings are opposite, and then the third ring appears on the same side as the second one, this is the late dodge pattern. For this one, start on the correct side, wait for 2 cleaves before dodging. Finally, if from bottom to top you see a perfect zigzag in the rings, this is the no dodge. Go to the safe side and stay there and resist the urge to walk into an AoE, because the safe side is consistent for all 3 attacks. Another really common thing we're going to see throughout this fight are these light and dark aspected debuffs. Main tank has the light debuff, off tank has the dark debuff, sometimes referred to as the red debuff. These mean nothing by themselves, but they allow you to deal with mechanics of the opposite element. For instance, H1 and H2 have what's called the tower debuff. H1's debuff is going to drop a light tower, while H2's is going to drop a dark tower. If you try to soak the towers with the same element, the towers will explode, wiping the group. So you need to make sure that they're always soaked by players with the opposite element debuff. Another mechanic we get for this are these lasers you see on M2 and R2. R2 has the light laser, M2 has the dark laser. These lasers are essentially light party line stacks, but they can only be soaked by players with the opposite element. What this means is that you need to have only players with the light aspected debuff with the dark laser, and only dark aspected players with the light laser. Note, if you're a tower player and you get the sides mixed up, it will not kill you immediately, but when your tower drops, you'll have the wrong debuff, and your tower will kill you instead. Now on to the fight. The fight starts with On the Soul, which is a hard-hitting raid-wide, so make sure to mitigate it. Afterwards is Paradeigma. The first Paradeigma is always going to spawn 4 adds that will appear on the sides of either the north half of the arena or the south half. What I'm showing here is currently the south half positions. 2 at a time, these adds will target the 2 nearest players with lasers. Since these lasers are going to go off 4 at a time, we have an entire light party line up from middle down to the southern edge, spread out so that they only get hit by 1 laser each, while the other light party hides up in the north. How you line these players up is entirely up to you, but make sure that your melees and tanks are within melee range, and that your least mobile players are nearer to mid. The boss will cast Trinity of Souls during this, and it's always going to be a bottom to top. The one I'm showing here is the late dodge, meaning that the group are going to be on the same side for the first 2 attacks, and then swap over for the third. When Trinity of Souls finishes casting, the first lasers get blasted. The group needs to swap with the second group during this, because each of those lasers gives a magic vuln up, so a person can't take 2 lasers back to back without an invuln. We dodge the second half cleave, and because it was a late dodge, the entire group's going to swap sides, while group 2 get into their positions. If this seems a little bit complicated and you don't feel like doing it, let me introduce you to what's referred to as lazy lasers. Here, the tanks are going to be positioned on the same side as the adds, just sort of at the edge of the hitbox. They pop invuln before the first laser goes off, and then all we do is avoid Trinity of Souls. The tanks will take all of the lasers, but because they're invulned, they're perfectly fine. Note, it is not possible to time it so that you will still have your invuln up for the next auto attack, and the main tank will have a magic vuln for it, meaning that if you do not mitigate this heavily, your main tank's going to die to the auto. I recommend having your main tank take it with a long and short cooldown, help from the off tank with their short cooldown, and also some healer help, little things like Aqua Veil, Divine Benison, or the sort. The next mechanic is Paradeigma 2. For this one, you're going to get 4 adds that are always going to spawn at the cardinals, but shifted slightly off-center, either clockwise or counterclockwise. The boss will cast Engravement of Souls, and we're going to get debuffs, so let me bring up the party list. When Engravement of Souls finishes, the 2 red orbs will spawn adds, but we'll worry about them later. We're going to get Dark and Light Tethers, and we're going to get Dark and Light Tower debuffs. Note that these are role-based, meaning that within the supports, you're going to have 1 Dark Tower, 1 Dark Tether, 1 Light Tower, 1 Light Tether, and the same for DPS. How we resolve this is quite simple. All you need to do is stretch your tethers out. Max melee directly opposite your add will usually do it just fine. For the debuff players, we need to drop a tower next to a player with the tether of the opposite element. So what we want here is we want those light towers to be right next to the 2 dark tether players, and we want the dark tower players to be next to the light tether players. To do this in an orderly fashion without having to adjust, you can use a simple priority system. Something like DPS always look northwest and then counterclockwise to find the right player they're looking for. Supports always look north and then clockwise. Some groups will do this add relative, where you do a similar priority, but you look at the add and follow them to your position instead. It's entirely up to your group what you choose. However you do it, it should look something like this when you're in the right spots, with 1 player per intercardinal, and they're next to a tethered player with the opposite element. The tethers go off, the towers drop, and now tethered players are just going to wiggle into their towers. Right about now is where you want to look north, because about 2 seconds after the towers resolve, the north adds are going to shoot lasers, cleaving essentially 2 giant lanes of the arena. Just make sure that you avoid where they are, and the lasers will go off and you're fine. There's an On the Soul raid wide, and then we get our Tankbuster. This works very similarly to the Tankbuster in P12S Phase I, if you remember that one, except for without the bleed. The idea is it's a double swap. So main tank is targeted with the first laser, off tank needs to provoke during the cast, and then off tank will get the second hit, and main tank needs to provoke because each hit gives a magic vuln that will cause you to die to the auto if you don't swap back again. Note that this Tankbuster hits incredibly hard, so make sure you're popping plenty of cooldowns. Next up is Superchain Theory I. After the big flash on the screen, you're going to see some chains appear, and now let me take a second to break these down. The green orb works exactly the same way it did in normal mode. It's an out. Note that being on the cardinal waymarks on either side of it is perfect distance to be out. The blue donut is an in, and being inside of the cardinal waymarks will make sure you're always on the in. The red spiky one is Protean wave style spreads, so you need all your players in their clock spots. And the purple one is instead partners. Superchain Theory I is always going to be the same basic combo with some slight variations. First off, a random corner is going to have either in-out combined with spread or pairs. You just resolve both of them at the exact same time. The 2 adjacent corners will appear next, and one's an out, one's an in, we will always dodge towards the in. Finally, the last one is always going to be an in followed by an out, or an out followed by an in, the longer tether going off second. So the one that you see here is an out, then in. After the flash, look at your first 2, in this case it's an in and spread, and immediately get yourself into those positions, so hugging tight to the cluster in this case, and in their clock spots. The boss will start to cast Engravement of Souls. Before it finishes, you're going to be able to see your next safe spot. In this case, the group's going to all head to 1 because it's the donut. And when Engravement of Souls finishes casting, we get a bunch of the light and dark debuffs appearing. What you're going to have is, within one roll, you're going to have a light laser, a dark laser, a light tower, a dark tower. The other roll is going to have 2 light aspected players, 2 dark aspected players, and if you looked at the DPS, that final debuff is a spread we'll worry about near the end. Just take note of your debuff while staying in the initial positions, waiting for the mechanic to go off. Afterwards, we're going to start dodging towards the safe spot, the donut, and while doing this, this is where it's important that we take note of our debuffs, because the lasers are about to go off. We need to have the dark laser player stacked with all 3 of the light aspected players, and the light laser stacked with all 3 of the dark aspected players. A simple way to remember how to do this, something that I first heard, I think, from Yuki Zuri, is light left, red right, lasers opposite. So all the light players are left facing in, all of the red players or dark players are right facing in, the lasers are the only ones that do the opposite of that pattern to make sure they're with the opposite element players. As long as you're within the donut and in your correct groups, the donut and the point blank will go off, the lasers go off, and you're fine. Now we head to the final corner. In this case, it's an out followed by an in, so the group will go near to it, wait for the out to go off, and then adjust into the donut afterwards. When doing so, we worry about our final debuffs. The ones that we need to worry about are the towers in particular. For this, we have the tower players go to the left and the right relative within the safe spot, with the light player going left and the dark player going right. The two other supports that had the lasers are going to go on the same side they went for their laser, but they want to start off north or south just to make sure that they're out of the way of the towers and don't get clipped. Afterwards, they're going to be the ones to soak the towers. Finally, all of the other role, in this case, all of the DPS have this spread debuff here. This goes off at the same time that the towers resolve, which is why none of them can soak the towers. They just need to get away. For this, you have melees run all the way through the boss, and range run directly opposite the boss. Wait until the second part of the in-out or out-in goes off, and then start to move. Focus on getting away from the tower players because the towers go off very quickly, and getting clipped will usually lead to you dying. Afterwards now, the DPS or whoever has the spreads can spread, and the laser players go in to soak their towers. When all's done, you just get a Trinity of Souls that's either top to bottom or bottom to top. For the most part, this is just a chance for you to be able to res anybody who died at the end of Superchain. Afterwards is one of two mechanics. Apodialogos is going to target the furthest player with a 2-person Tankbuster, and the nearest player with a stack. So the tanks need to be stacked at the edge, and the group needs to be stacked in the middle. Peridialogos, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. The nearest player gets the 2-person Tankbuster, and the furthest player gets the stack. So tanks middle, party goes to the edge. People sometimes remember this with parry, party out. Be aware that this is a pretty hard-hitting Tankbuster, and it comes with a bleed, so make sure tanks are mitigating it. When all's said and done, you get on the soul raid-wide, and then the boss is going to cast another Paradeigma. Paradeigma 3. This is always going to spawn 4 adds east and west in the exact same positions. The boss will start to cast Engravement of Souls, and you want to lightly spread out. DPS just want to be spread so they can see what tether they're about to get, and tanks and healers don't have to be spread, but sometimes it helps to conga line to help you to figure out your priority in a second. Because when Engravement of Souls finishes, all of the supports are going to get debuffs. One player's going to get a plus, one player's going to get an X, and the other 2 players are going to get towers of the same element, either both light or both dark. The DPS are always all going to get tethered. 2 of them light, 2 of them dark, and light and dark tethers are always going to come from the same side. We're also going to get the boss casting Unnatural Enchainment and destroying 4 of the platforms in a zigzag pattern, and we get towers on the 4 safe platforms. It's a lot to deal with, but there's a simple procedure to how to figure out where to go. First, the plus and the X player should have fixed positions. My group had the plus always go north, the X always go south. The other 2 supports need to go east and west, and this is why I had them line up beforehand. Usually you want a priority for this. What I've got here is essentially the healer anchor version, where the healers will always go west or east respectively, and the tanks adjust. In this case, main tank is going to go west, and off tank is going to go east. For the tethers, these are a little bit tricky. If you can stretch your tether perfectly horizontally, like these 2 players can, you do so, and you only go out far enough to make sure that your tether is just changed into the stretched version. If you can't stretch it horizontally without standing on a platform that's about to be destroyed, you instead cross the tethers. Cross tethers want to go all the way to the edge of that platform that they're on, but they also only want to go out as far as they need to stretch their tether. It's a little bit finicky, but if the horizontal tethers are perfectly horizontal and the stretched cross tethers only go far enough to stretch their tethers, you should be all right and nobody's going to get clipped. Be aware, this does mean that the supports that are in the towers between the tethers need to use their eyes. Remember that the tethers are about to turn into lasers, and you don't want to get hit by those lasers, so adjust slightly to the north or south edge towards the crossed tether player within your tower. We also get these adds appearing, but we'll deal with them later. Unnatural Enchainment is going to go off, the towers get resolved, the chained platforms get destroyed, and the tethers go off. Now we need to deal with the debuffs. The player with the plus needs to go all the way to the outside corner, and the player with the X needs to go all the way to the inside outer corner. This is because they're going to drop telegraphed AoEs, and you want to make sure that you leave as much of the inside platform safe as possible. Now we need to deal with the tower player debuffs. In this case, the tanks. What the tanks should have been doing is when they were sat in their towers, they're looking at the tethers that were in front of them. Main tank has a light tower and is on a side with 2 dark tethers. This makes life quite easy for them because all they need to do is move in and drop that tower somewhere on the platform away from those players. Similarly, R1 and R2 are just going to make sure they're not in the Telegraphed X AoE, but also not too near to the main tank to get clipped by their tower. The off-tank has it a little bit trickier. See, they have a light tower, but the 2 players on their side had light tethers. That means that they can't drop their tower just anywhere on the platform. Instead, they need to go perfectly middle. The idea is that if they drop their tower here, a little part of the tower is going to leak over to the other platform, and one of the dark aspected DPS can soak it instead. With everybody in the right position, now it's time to deal with the adds. These will target the 2 nearest players with lasers. One of those players should always be the supports that dropped the plus and the X. They just need to go in slightly and make sure they're one of the nearest players. The other laser baits should be done by the DPS who aren't taking towers. In this case, M1 and M2. They've got the light debuff, they can't soak the light tower, so instead they go to the cardinal waymarks nearest to them, and that'll allow them to be the other person to bait the laser. Be aware that the dark aspected DPS, the ones that are about to soak towers in this case, need to just make sure they're not too far near to the cardinal waymarks, otherwise they might bait a laser instead. The telegraphs go off, the lasers go off, the towers drop, and now all that's left is for the DPS who can soak towers to soak towers. Usual pattern is for the crossed tether player to soak the middle tower, and the straight tether player to soak the outer tower. With all that done, the boss is going to cast On the Soul, and make sure that you move towards middle because you're probably going to be low on health. Your healers need to be able to top you up. On the Soul will also restore all the platforms back. We get another Tankbuster, including the swaps, and then the boss is going to turn around, spawn some adds in, and start to glow. Mitigate what's about to be a very hard-hitting raid wide before the stage transitions for our next major mechanic. Start to spread out. The adds will disappear. The boss will eventually disappear and reappear untargetable on one of the points of this octagon we're in. It's a limit cut. Everybody gets the numbers 1 through 8. Let me break this down. First off, this is a standard limit cut. The boss is going to dash from player 1 to player 2 to player 3 to player 4 and so on. These are proximity-based dashes, so you need to be as far away as possible, and when you are hit by a dash, you're going to leave a puddle centered on the player who was jumped on. Be aware that the proximity is quite tight. For instance, on this last one that I've shown here, here's where R1 couldn't be stood without taking what will almost certainly be lethal damage. So you need to make sure that whenever you're getting dashed on, you are hugging the wall, or you're going to take too much damage and die. To add an extra wrinkle to this, these dashes need to be taken in groups of 2. For this, 1 and 3 will always be together, 2 and 4 always together, 5 and 7 together, and 6 and 8 together. What I'm showing here is what a lot of groups in PF do, which is have 2 and 4 dodge the initial dash and then move back to their initial spot. Note that the actual AoE hitbox of the dash is quite small, so don't worry too much about getting clipped by it. Once 1 and 3 have been dashed on, 2 and 4 move back and get dashed on. 1 and 3 have adjusted just outside of their next puddle. And as soon as they take their second hit together, 1 and 3 are going to leapfrog over 5 and 7. 2 and 4 are going to do the same after they take their second dash together. Now 5 and 7 are in a position. 6 and 8 will take the next one. 5 and 7 for the next one. And 6 and 8 for the last one. If you're finding the proximity damage sort of finicky or getting killed from too much proximity damage, one thing you can do is instead of having 2 and 4 adjust to where the boss was, you can have them just stay where they initially were, middle of the wall at the beginning. This will make the first dash a little bit shorter, but it's going to make all of the other dashes a more even length and make it a little bit less likely you'll die to proximity damage. Something to try out if you can convince your group to. Finally, in addition to all the dashes, we need to deal with these adds that jump into middle and will do one of 2 things. Either a very small AoE around them to mean that you can't ever go perfectly middle of the arena, or target the 2 nearest players for lasers. These lasers will be baited in a specific order to make sure that we don't kill the players during their dashes. 5 and 7 take the first set, 6 and 8 the second set, 1 and 3 the third set, and 2 and 4 the fourth set. At the start of the mechanic, 5 and 7 should position slightly more in off the wall so that they can take the first laser baits. These will go off just before the first dash. First dash happens, and now 6 and 8 after the lasers can now move in just slightly off the wall so that they take the second laser set. They've got some time as there's usually some of these point-blank AoEs first. Once 6 and 8 get blasted with their lasers, 1 and 3 should have already done the leapfrog, and now they're just going to make sure that they move in so that they can take the next set of lasers. Once 1 and 3 get blasted, 2 and 4 should immediately move in to make sure they are in position for the next set of lasers. From there, just make sure everybody's out of the way and continue dealing with the limit cut jumps as we mentioned before. When you've finished, have everybody in the group adjust either towards all north or all south, and then once the platform returns to normal, get to the edge because the boss will destroy all 4 of the middle platforms. The boss will then start to cast Theos' Ultima. This is both an incredibly hard-hitting raid-wide and, because it splits the damage amongst all the alive players, a bit of a body check, because if too many players are dead, the damage will likely be lethal. Next up, the boss is going to immediately jump into another major mechanic, Superchain Theory IIA. When this finishes casting, you're going to see a ton of different chains appear. It initially looks quite complicated, so let's try to break it down to make it more understandable. The mechanic essentially is just pairs followed by an in, followed by pairs or spread. What you want to do is you want to look at the short chains. The middle one is always going to be an out, and for north and south, one will be an out, one is going to be the purple pairs. We will always dodge and do the mechanic near to the purple pairs one, in this case in the south. The second one is always going to be an in, and it's always going to be middle, so you will just dodge to the middle for the middle part of the mechanic. Finally, the long ones, 2 of them will be out, and one will either be a pair or spread. The pair spread is either going to be north or south, so we're only ever going to dodge around that. The middle one is always going to be an out. What adds to the difficulty of this mechanic is that Trinity of Souls will be going on during it. So for our initial pairs, we get into our pairs positions, but we need to adjust to make sure everybody's on the same side. Since there's an out going off in middle at the same time, the 2 players nearest to middle, M2 and off tank in this case, need to be either really closely hugged to that cluster, or they can take this position instead, which allows them to avoid it, whichever one you're more comfortable with. Look at the rest of the Trinity of Souls, and remember when your dodges is. Currently, we see a late dodge pattern here, so we're going to dodge to the other side after the 2 cleaves. We're in positions for the initial pairs. We then need to immediately dodge towards middle for the in donut. Because it's a late dodge, we're going to all go to the other side of the arena while getting near to the final mechanic, which is pairs in the south. For this, wait for the 3rd cleave to go off, then adjust over and use the entirety of the arena to be able to do your pairs or spreads competently. Let me replay this and show you what it would look like with a slightly different set of mechanics. With this combination here, short tethers, we're doing pairs in the south again. Middle is always going to be a donut, so that's second. And then finally, the 3rd one is instead going to be spreads and in the north. We look at the Trinity of Souls and see that this time it's a no dodge pattern. So the group will stay on the west side of the arena for the entirety of it. We're in our pairs positions. Immediately dodge towards middle. And then finally, make sure you're on the correct side for the cleave. And as soon as it goes off, adjust to deal with the spreads. Be aware that the spreads need to be careful to not be too near to middle to make sure they don't get hit by the out. So M1 and M2 are again hugging quite close to the cluster. Afterwards, you get a random Apodialogos or a Peridialogos, and you get an On the Soul raid-wide. Next up is Superchain Theory IIB. This initially starts looking simple, but will get more complicated each time. It starts off with just a north and south cluster, one's an in, one's an out, the safe spot is the in. The boss will cast Paradeigma, and we get our second cluster. One will be an out, and one will be either pairs or spread. We will dodge to the side with the pairs or spread, in this case, the west side. The 3rd set will also appear shortly afterwards. This is going to be north and south. One of them is just an out. The other one is an out and a spread. We want to find that red chain, the spread. That's the way we're going to go towards. So in this case, we're dodging to south at the end. The red crystals will go off to show ads, but we can worry about them when we need to. First, the in-out. Make sure you're not too near to middle so you don't get clipped by the out. The boss will cast Parthenos, which is just a line AoE through the middle of their hitbox. We dodge to the side where there was the pair or the spread. In this case, it's a pair on that side. As soon as the Parthenos goes off, we adjust to be able to take our pairs. Now we need to deal with those lasers from the ads in the north. Note that the safe spot for them is much smaller than the first time that we dealt with this, so make sure you're positioned nowhere near to an ad. As soon as the ad lasers go off, we deal with the out and the spread at the same time. With all that done, the boss will have been casting Unnatural Enchainment, and there's only going to be a single tile safe. It should be near to where you finished off. Adjust onto that tile before the other platforms get destroyed, and stay there to deal with the final bits of the fight. There's an On the Soul raid wide that will restore the platform back, though it doesn't really matter because all that's left is another On the Soul raid wide, 2 autos, and then if the boss isn't at 0%, the boss will become untargetable and cast the Enrage. If you manage to get the boss down below 0% in time, Welcome to Phase 2, and good luck with that. Thank you so much for watching this guide. I hope you found this useful. Let me know in the comment section if you've got any tips or suggestions for better ways to resolve these mechanics. Sorry it's taken me so long to do this one. I'll try to be quicker in the future, but real life sometimes has to come first. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.